Hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of the Digital Empathy Lounge brought to you by Anthralytics. If you haven't come across it before, the Digital Empathy Lounge is a podcast which is focusing on the best and next practices in experience management, and especially what those experiences should look and feel like. Now, today I'm in conversation with Alec Dalton, who is the partner and co-founder of the Hospitality Leadership Academy. Hello, Alec.
Peter, thank you for having me. And thank you to everybody listening in.
It's our pleasure, Alec. So before we begin, Alec, I'd like you to, if you wouldn't mind, just take a moment or two and tell us a bit about yourself and your role at the Academy.
Certainly. So as the partner and co-founder of the Hospitality Leadership Academy, my partners and I help organizations, both boutique and brand name, design and develop customer service experiences, as well as develop and deploy custom training programs to help organizations deliver five-star customer experiences, whether they be in the hospitality business or retail, healthcare, or anything in between. Before forming HLA, the Hospitality Leadership Academy, I served for about 10 years within the hotel business, most recently with Marriott International at the corporate office, leading quality improvement technology systems. And prior to that, I spent some great experiences with the Ritz-Carlton, Walt Disney Parks and Resorts, and a number of other organizations, learning the business from the ground up and being able to eventually serve the industry at scale. Most recently, again, with Marriott at 7,600 hotels worldwide.
Wow. So quite a wide-ranging experience, and not just, as you say, for the hospitality sector either. So, Alec, let's begin with this. Now, I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that over the last decade or so, the hospitality sector has been on a journey of evolution. So it's really evolved quite a lot. I can remember from when I first started to stay in hotels to where it is today. And we'll come to recent events in a moment. But before we do, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about, in your view, that evolution of the sector, and particularly the importance of something I think you've called service science.
Right, exactly, Peter. There's been a ton of transformation over the last several years, but it's been preceded by decades, if not centuries, of innovation in customer experience that have come from the hospitality industry. And I refer to it as service science. It's the application of scientific principles like behavioral science, like industrial engineering, to design and deliver more effective services that both engage customers as well as employees and that deliver successful bottom lines through operational excellence. But other names for that practice include guestology, a term pioneered by Bruce Lavelle, a former executive at Disney. And my favorite example of service science or guestology actually comes from the Disney organization, and believe it or not, from Walt Disney himself back in the 1950s. When he opened Disneyland, his intention was to basically be the anti-amusement park. At that time in the history of amusements, parks were dirty and dangerous places, and he instead wanted a clean, safe space where families could gather together and make some fun memories. So one of Walt's intentions was that the parks would be spotless. He hired an enormous cadre of custodial cast members, or cast members and employee in Disney's parlance. And despite having such robust staffing, he found shortly after the park's opening that there was still trash everywhere. And trying to get underneath that and correct that customer experience defect, he himself, along with several of his colleagues, would sit on the park bench in Main Street and watch. An early example of a great observational study. And they essentially did observations on both guests as well as employees to understand how trash was accumulating. They had trash cans, they had custodians, but why was it building up? They determined that at approximately 30 paces, a customer with a piece of waste in their hand, let's say a hot dog wrapper or an empty soda cup, if within those 30 paces there was a receptacle, they would throw that trash away in the receptacle. And if there was not, they would tend to throw it on the ground. So what Walt Disney was able to do is not only right size his custodial staff, but also increase the number of trash receptacles in the park, so that guests self-served in keeping the place clean without as much of a dependency on the Disney organization to follow up behind them and do so. The interesting thing is that today, if you were to go into, let's say, Frontierland in the Magic Kingdom in Orlando, Florida, you'd find about 120 trash receptacles scattered throughout the area. but you probably wouldn't realize that. You don't go around looking left and right and detecting a trash can popping up everywhere you go. And that's because Disney is also very deliberate when it comes to their customer experience in terms of theming and world building. And if you're in Frontierland, the trash cans resemble wooden barrels. If you're in Tomorrowland, they're a bit more mechanically oriented, but they blend into the scenery. And that's another key area that Disney did a lot of innovation in over the last several decades. They've been partnered with Kodak to determine the right shades of paint that won't detract some of the industrial aspects of the park from taking away from family photographs. Famously, they have a shade of green called Go Away Green that they use for music and audio systems, or what they call blending blue, which is used for show buildings that might appear above tree lines, again, with the goal of not detracting from pictures or deteriorating from those theming. But Disney isn't the only example of a company that in the hospitality business that has gone above and beyond when it comes to designing behaviorally oriented experiences. In the 1970s, Boston Consulting Group got pretty active in a process called menu engineering. Basically, how does a restaurant construct a menu that's both appealing to its customers, but also that maximizes profit by helping customers with gentle nudges on which choices to select within the menu. On the hotel side of the business, Marriott, from an industrial engineering standpoint, pioneered a famous 66-step housekeeping process. And then in both 1992 and 1999, the Ritz-Carlton very famously received the prestigious Malcolm Baldrige Award. The National Quality Award in the United States was the first hotel company to do so, and to do it twice was outstanding. That focus on quality, that focus on service systems, though, isn't just limited to luxury hotels. Interestingly enough, 2 years later, a regional fast food chain selling hot dogs and hamburgers called Pal's Sudden Service did the same thing. They won the Baldrige Award in 2001, showing that any organization can apply deliberate processes, can deploy operational excellence in service to their customers. To just add a few more applications here on the more recent end of the spectrum, thinking about the digital empathy lounge, Amazon Echo and Alexa, popular services where consumers speak to their technology and get responsive communications back and responsive service. That's entering the hotel space. Marriott was partnering with the brand as early as 2017 to experiment with echoes in the room to see if you can add new meaning to the term brand voice. And even as recent as 4 days ago, Florida International University's Bacardi Center of Excellence has deployed what they call Cecilia, but it's the first robotic bartender. She can make 120 drinks per hour while cracking jokes and keeping the bar entertained all the while. So in a nutshell, the industry has had a plethora of interesting examples where the application, again, of behavioral science, of industrial engineering, quality sciences, all blends together, not only to deliver profit for the organization, but to create unique, memorable, and satisfying experiences for customers along the way.
Great, thanks very much, Alex. So, some interesting points. And some of the things I was hearing, that great customer service isn't just about the human relationship part, that there is actually a role for technology, and the hospitality sector has actually been at the forefront of the adoption of some of these technologies to deliver that. But another thing I think I was hearing from what you were saying, and I was thinking of that Disney example about the trash cans, was, we sometimes hear that a great customer experience is no experience, i.e. that the customer doesn't think about it. I think actually what we're doing here is we're using science. So it's not no experience, it's just that it's not a conscious experience, that the customer will self-serve when they're not consciously having to think about, where's a trash can, what do I do with this, when, as you say, they're not looking around to try and figure out where to put that empty paper cup. So the use of science and technology, I think, combined with the human element, is, of course, really important. Now, let's talk for a moment. I'm going to use the horrible C word, COVID. So 2 years ago or so, from the time that we're recording this right now, the whole world went through a massive paradigm shift. The hospitality sector, I think we're all aware, was incredibly impacted by the pandemic, with lockdowns, with changes in the way that service could be delivered, and also in changes in the way that consumers thought and behaved. And I was wondering, now that we seem to be entering a new phase, so I think that people are being less reactive now and starting to think again about the future and prepare for the future. What do you think that the things we've gone through for the last 2 years in the sector mean for hospitality and other sectors in the future?
There are a number of changes, some short term, some long term. But I think in order to understand those, we have to go back a little bit to what the world was like 2 years ago. And I know we have an international audience here. It's a little difficult to paint an international picture of COVID, though, because it transpired in phases, moving all around the globe in a what seems like a somewhat asynchronous manner. I was working at Marriott's headquarters at the time, and I remember hearing inklings from colleagues in the Asia Pacific region of the world as early as November, approximately, of 2019, that COVID was emerging, that it was a disease of concern, that it was impacting hotel operations. But it really wasn't until the middle of March 2020 in the United States that we saw what felt like a sudden shock, a weekend lockdown that was allegedly going to last about 2 weeks. That is, like you pointed out, Peter, at the time of this recording, is going on to 2 years. It sent shockwaves throughout the industry, and to a certain extent continues in some respects. Back in March in the United States, March 2020, hotel occupancy was hovering around mid 60%. That's pretty normal for that time of year in the US. And then overnight, once lockdowns began, dropped to the mid 20s suddenly, sharply. And for an industry that is dependent on an inflow of customers to supply cash, it's a very cash intensive business, the alarm bells are ringing. What's happened since then, when you look at it from a consumer behavior standpoint, actually, in my opinion, mirrors the Rogers technology adoption curve. So at the onset, if we all kind of put ourselves back to where we were around 2020 when the pandemic began, nobody really knew a lot about COVID. Even the scientists were still trying to understand how virulent the disease was, what possible cures were for those who contracted the virus. We didn't yet have vaccines, and so the risk was incredibly high for transmission. There were just so many unknown variables from a science standpoint, as well as from a customer experience standpoint across industries. Was it safe to go to a grocery store and shop for food and supplies? Was it safe to travel? Was it safe to go to a restaurant, enjoy a meal? All of these questions emerge, and the social tendency was somewhat supported or at least forced through government lockdowns that helped us make some of those decisions for us by saying, no, you have to stay inside. You have to stay in your home. And progressively, as those regulations and restrictions eased, the next question for many consumers reverted back to those earlier questions. For me as an individual, what do I feel comfortable with? What's my level of risk tolerance? And to address that, we look to a couple of things. We look at different businesses that we consume from. Retail was implementing practices around the use of hand sanitizer, for example. Masks were becoming more and more pronounced. The hospitality industry borrowed essentially from the retail business to figure out, well, if they're having success there, we can have success in our front of house interactions with our guests. Organizations in hospitality partnered with public health experts and scientists to try and understand what's the most effective way to clean a room, right? Can we have housekeepers going in and out of rooms every day? Is that safe for the employee? Is that safe for the guest? The answer at that time was, we're not quite sure, so let's play it safe and not do that. Guests were essentially quarantined within their rooms. Housekeepers wouldn't be able to go in until a few days after, but there was, a learning curve until progressively we've gotten to where we are today and learned enough about the disease and how to prevent the spread of infection to the greatest extent possible. Social proof played an enormous role in that as well. Being able to see what your friends and family members are doing, it could be hugely influential. Along the way, uh, independently and with a team of academic researchers at Boston University and Oxford Brookes University in the UK, I partnered on some academic research into this to try and figure out what are the trust factors influencing frequent travelers' decisions to return to travel, to feel comfortable traveling, to trust the enterprises that they travel to, especially from an accommodations and lodging standpoint. Those are some interesting observations. When asked, essentially kind of on a binary scale, if they would feel safe staying in a branded hotel, for example, this would have been within a couple of months of the pandemic. Think about May 2020. About 76% of our respondents, past travelers, said yes, they would feel safe staying in a branded hotel. But for an independent hotel, only 51% said that they'd feel safe. Right in the middle, 68%, actually leaning a bit more closer towards branded hotels, 68% of respondents said that they'd feel comfortable staying in a relative's home. More so, again, than that 51% at the independent hotel, and more so than 49% who said they'd feel safe at an Airbnb or a VRBO or some other type of home sharing accommodation. What that said to us was that brands particularly can possess trust. They build reputations over time. Oftentimes, brands are perceived to have the scale and resources to deal with a calamity of this scale and nature, more so perhaps than independent entities or independently branded entities, at least. And so, as organizations are rebounding, and this behavior and mindset continues to this day, I think it's important for branded organizations to recognize the goodwill that their brands have and make sure that they preserve that goodwill, because in times of crisis, it can foster trust. For those independent organizations, let's say an independent hotel or a mom and pop shop, it's important for them to figure out alternative ways to build their reputation. That might be through partnerships. We saw instances where organizations were partnering with brands like Clorox or Lysol, where the hotel might not have brand equity of its own, but they could tap into the brand equity of a trusted expert in cleanliness, let's say, in order to assure guests of the care and comfortability that would be provided, the safety and sanitation along the way. Another important observation here that will surely be familiar to your listeners is that it's evocative of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Where the pyramid begins with those physical needs, safety and security, as we work our way up towards that pinnacle of self-actualization. And in pre-COVID times, I guess we're always conscious of cleanliness, but it may not have been at the forefront of their minds when they were staying with us. They may have been more conscious about factors like the price or location of a hotel, or different amenities offered, or the level of service, on a scale from economy to luxury. But with COVID, it was very much a reminder to the general population of the importance and the foundational importance in that pyramid of safety, of hygiene, and that if you don't have those baselines, those foundations, it's a lot more difficult to enjoy some of those other add-ons and amenities that would ordinarily make a stay most worthwhile and memorable. So those were a couple of snapshot observations and things that I recommend businesses keep in mind as they continue to navigate the challenges of COVID and beyond.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. And again, if you wouldn't mind, I'll just spend a moment reflecting on some of the things you said. So very interesting is you pointed out the sort of shocks in the system. I think we've still got plenty of volatility and uncertainty ahead. And the hospitality sector, as we both agree, really affected. So a lot of people are talking about how do we remain agile so that we can adjust to things as they happen, but we also need some resilience. And after all, you can't sell yesterday's vacant room. So it's
right. I wish we could.
So that's, I think, for the hospitality sector is a real driver. But you touched on something I think that is as much a functional as a psychological one, which is trust. Now, the research that we've done on trust, it does figure immensely in people's thinking about who do I do business with? And for many consumers, what they ask of their brands is be explicit about what you're going to do so that I can align myself to those brands that make those value promises which align with the values that I want to get.
Mhm.
But secondly, you must deliver on your promise. That's where trust
Right.
comes from. It's that consistency of delivering against the promise time after time after time. And as you pointed out, if you don't have the brand equity yet, maybe you can borrow that trust from other people. Because one of the things that stands out about trust is when you're trusted, your customers are prepared to accept new things, novelty,
Right.
new solutions. They're prepared to accept assurance that, you know, we will treat you in this way. Whereas it's much more difficult to put that trust in an unknown quantity and say, well,
Right.
you know, you say the right things, but I'm not sure that that's what I'm going to get out of it. So I think trust is absolutely imperative there. But I do just want to end on one final thing, because when we were talking about this really threw me, and I think it's so interesting to explore this. You've mentioned to me in the past the service recovery paradox. So what is that? What is it that we have to think about when things go, in quotes, wrong? And how can organizations use service as a way of rebounding back to right after something went wrong?
You know, with my origins in quality within the hospitality businesses, I dream of a perfect experience, but I'm humble enough to know how difficult that can be to accomplish every single time for every guest everywhere around the world, especially in a larger organization, but really in a service organization of any size where there is so much room for variability and and just human to human contact that deliberately or not can lead to some challenging situations. The service recovery paradox essentially articulates that when things go wrong, if they are adequately solved, the trust or satisfaction that a customer had before the problem happened can actually be surpassed if a great enough recovery is performed. So let me give you a good example of this. Let's say you come to stay at a hotel, and um, when you go to check in, it's 3 o'clock. You're guaranteed to be able to get into your room, but the room isn't available. The room, at least that you reserved, isn't available. That's a disappointing experience. What the hotel can do alternatively is, on one hand, they could say, well, Mr. Dorrington, I'd like you to wait for a little while. We'll call you when the room is ready. Eventually you'll get your room, right? But you're not going to be happy necessarily having to wait, especially when a promise, a commitment, an expectation was already made that you would be able to get into a room. That's a surefire way to deplete trust. What the hotel could alternatively do is, and what oftentimes happens, right, is they'll offer you a different form of accommodation, perhaps an upgraded room that might be immediately available. For the hotel, that room might not have actually been sold that night, so it's space they had available. It doesn't really cost them any extra to place you in that room, but it does appeal to you because it still solves your need. And the hotel did so in a way that was apologetic, that was recognizing of your perhaps of your loyalty, but at very least of your patronage in that instance. And it's wise of them to be able to offer that upgrade. So again, you achieve your success. The hotel achieves its success. You get accommodated, and you get a bit wowed with more space or different amenities in the room or different features or things like that. Oftentimes in scenarios, again, this is what the paradox describes, your satisfaction checking into that beautiful suite is probably going to be a bit higher than your satisfaction would have been if you had just gotten the room that you had originally reserved. As long as, and this is the big caveat, as long as that service experience, that exchange is played out transparently, fairly, with respectful communication, and with just enough ounce of surprise and delight on the part of the service provider to make sure that your needs were taken care of.
Yeah, thanks, Alec. And this is the other side of the paradox. And I know that working with some airlines, this has been an issue. So occasionally, I don't know about you, but I've flown coach, and then you get a free upgrade. And you get
Right.
to turn left instead of turning right as you board. And that's a great experience. And you think, wow, this is brilliant. I get a better seat. You know, I get proper metal cutlery instead of plastic or wood. And that, don't get me wrong, great experience. But the next time I turn up at the airline at the airport, I'm kind of hoping I'm going to get upgraded again.
Right.
And of course I don't. And now I'm disappointed. So what was, would have been an acceptable experience. Now I'm kind of feeling a little bit deflated. So I think your point about transparency and expectation, that you have to be open about this, that it's not to say to people, oh, you've been super treated, this is so exceptional, we're going to give you that upgrade for there. But it's, you have to strike a balance. Because the trust thing, as we mentioned, is about expectation and how people feel about you as a brand, but consistency is so important.
Correct.
I fly economy quite a lot on economy. I know they're not going to bring me champagne to the seat, okay, but that's fine. It's basically flying in a bus with wings. Okay? So, and that's what I paid for, and that's okay. But if I was flying business somewhere else, then I would expect a different service experience. So I think for different people, it's different things, but it's what they value out of you as a brand. And it's that, for me, what's so interesting is, what do people expect? What is that empathetic relationship where we each understand each other? Because this is, again, another thing I think that many people don't appreciate. Empathy works both ways. Okay, right. So it's not just a one size fits all. I broadcast love and empathy to everybody else, and it's just a one-way street. That actually comes back in, for example, customers that think that they have been treated empathetically, that they're listened to and understood, are prepared to accept a delay when they think, well, I know that this is not what I expect, but you've listened to me, you've understood where I'm coming from. I still feel valued, even though there may not be that upgrade room available, and perhaps you do. Plonk me in the bar with a free drink and say, I'm sorry, your room being cleaned now, be ready in 30 minutes. But at least I've felt valued and understood.
Correct.
Anyway, Alec, great insights. Thank you so much. Really love talking to you again. I'm sure we're going to have you back. So with that, that's the end of this episode. Now, if anybody watching would like to take part, please do let me know. You can find out how in the comments below. But until then, Alec, thank you very much. And to everybody else, thank you and goodbye, and take care of yourself now. Thank you.
Peter, thank you very much for having me. Goodbye, everyone.
My pleasure, Alec. Take care. Bye-bye.